Gestalt Language Processing, AAC, ethics. We are getting into it in a future course here at ABA Speech. Did you know that at www.abaspeech.org, I list all of our upcoming CEU courses? Every single month, I do a live course, either myself or a speaker. And the next coming months for our back to school, I said it, back to school time, we're going to be talking about the ethics of collaboration around the ideas of Gestalt language processing, AAC, verbal imitation. In September, we're going to be talking about naturalistic interventions. We have so many wonderful things in store. Now, these CEUs, you can register for the webinars completely free, and that is going to be a link in the show notes. So make sure that you register. If you want to purchase a general certificate, that's $5. Members of the ABA Speech Connection membership, are you in the membership yet? If not, join us. There's over 300 professionals and parents in the membership. You get your CEUs completely free as part of your membership. But if you're like, hey, Rose, I'm not ready for the membership, that is okay too, because every single month you have the option to just pay for your single CEU. These are ASHA approved and ACE approved courses for BCBAs, professionals, and anybody who wants to attend. So make sure that you check the notes in the show notes that is going to have the link that will take you to register for our upcoming live events around the ideas of ethics, collaboration, Gestalt language processing, AAC, naturalistic interventions, and so much more. I cannot wait to see you on a future live course. Gestalt language processing. This is one of the topics that we cover today in my episode with Kathleen Oppenheimer. She is a speech language pathologist, and she's been doing that for 10 years. She received her undergraduate degree in linguistics in Chinese from Harvard College and her MS in speech language pathology from Northwestern University. She is currently in a PhD program, and I learned all about Kathleen's work because she has a stellar Instagram account called language_processing, where she shares information about language science research as it relates to clinical practice. We talk all today about, I ask her about Gestalt language processing. She discusses that on her page a bit. She talks about the research for language processing, which I think is really, really fascinating. We also talk about pseudoscience. She talked about a book I haven't read yet, but it sounds amazing. Why do smart people believe weird things? I really love that. She did talk about pseudoscience. One of the things she notes is that people are making up new terms that sound clinical. It is just great information. This episode is a little bit longer because I just kept bombarding Kathleen with questions because you know what? Inquiring minds want to know. I have a lot of questions about all of the above. So thank you, Kathleen, for coming onto the show. This is an amazing episode. If you like this episode, please let me know. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts for Autism Outreach Podcast. This is a wonderful, detail-oriented, but easy to listen to episode with Kathleen Oppenheimer.
You're listening to Autism Outreach Podcast, a podcast full of ready-to-use strategies to help those with autism strengthen their communication skills. Here's your host, Rose Griffin of ABA Speech, a speech therapist and board-certified behavior analyst who shares tips you can use in your next therapy session.
Welcome to the Autism Outreach Podcast. We have a guest that I'm very excited to talk with today. We have with us Kathleen Oppenheimer. Thank you so much for joining us for the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I was excited to correspond with you. We've been talking about doing this podcast for a while, and you have a really cool Instagram where you're sharing information about all kinds of research and things taking place in the field that are very interesting. And I appreciate your candor and just the facts that you share. I like facts. I like science. And I know you do too. So I'm excited to talk today. You have a really cool Instagram, which is language_processing. tell us how how did you, I want to start with my second question. I hope that's okay. I send along guest questions and we're jumping around a bit, but how did you get inspired to start sharing information on social media? I asked because one of my guests I'm having on at a different time, Dr. Jason Travers said, I don't do social media. It's too aversive. And I thought, yeah, some days it really is. But other days it's not, right? I've been able to grow my platform here at ABA Speech, and that's been really exciting. And I know that your Instagram has been growing too, just because you're sharing sound scientific information, which is so cool. But what started to get that inspiration for you to start sharing on social media? Because it's hard. It's a lot of work.
It is. It is a lot of work. I think it's good practice communicating science. So as a PhD student, I do my own research, but I also think that researchers have a responsibility to communicate our research effectively. And so part of it was, it seemed like a good way to practice communicating my research because you get that immediate feedback of either we love it, we hate it, are people understanding it? And I also felt like for the specific area where I've been sharing information, so language processing, kind of in response to some discussions of Gestalt language processing and natural language acquisition as a approach to therapy, that there were some pieces missing from the discussion where there's people supporting these approaches to therapy, there's people opposing these approaches, and none of them that I saw were talking about the linguistic research and the science research that could really contribute to that discussion. So I felt like I had a perspective on the issue that wasn't yet being shared on social media. And since social media is a place where many people are going to get information, I felt like it's important that if there's, one side or two sides of an issue and a missing side, I wanted to get more perspectives all in the same place. And so that's what brought me to social media for this particular account. More generally, I've always been very interested in spreading the word about linguistics. I think it's very fun. I love linguistics and language science and speech pathology. So I've been sharing about it on other platforms for a long time. I previously ran a different language science outreach Instagram account. I do career day visits. I go into elementary schools to teach kids about language science. So in a sense, this was just another outreach project for me but also there was that specific goal of getting more language science into a particular discussion that was happening.
Yeah. And I know that me and my friends, I think we call ourselves the nerd herd, duly certified people, really appreciated your account. And we're like, oh, this is interesting. And who is this person talking about all these fascinating topics? So I do appreciate that. And I am excited. I know the systematic review is supposed to be coming out in December of 2024, maybe earlier. And I've been talking about that a lot. We know that that's probably not going to change everybody's mind. But I do think that it will be a nice piece of information that then we can just share, that a lot of people will probably share and disseminate about it. So tell me, and I don't know the answer to this, you are a speech language pathologist. Like, how did you get started in the field? And then how did you get so excited that you wanted to go on for your PhD? I'm always very impressed and have a lot of PhDs on the podcast. My husband, after I got my BCBA, after being a speech therapist, he looked at me and said, "You're not going to go back to school ever again, are you?" And I was like, "No, honey, I promise." So I started a small business, and that was enough. But tell me a little bit about how you got started in the field, kind of what work settings you've been in, and then what really inspired you to then go on for further education.
Sure. So I am unusual in this sense in that I discovered linguistics first, and I discovered it in middle school, which is very unusual. Normally, we consider linguistics to be a discovery major, meaning people don't learn about it until they're in college or later and they discover it, as opposed to those majors like biology, where you kind of know it's a field before you start college for most people. And it was when I read the Lord of the Rings trilogy and I got really into all the languages of Middle Earth that the author J.R.R. Tolkien had created. And he didn't just create languages, he created language histories and language family trees. So I got into linguistics that way and started reading everything I could about historical linguistics, so the history of English, but also language acquisition in high school, and learning as many foreign languages as I could. So then I majored in linguistics and Chinese in college. Unfortunately, I've since forgotten most of my Chinese. But at the same time that I was doing all this, I was also volunteering a lot with kids with disabilities, particularly communication disabilities. And I got really interested in that as a career path. And so I realized as a linguistics major, as much as I loved it, I didn't see myself as an academic linguist, which was where, many people go in that
Yeah.
field. But speech pathology seemed like a perfect way to combine the two things I was really interested in. So supporting communication and also using linguistics. And then as I was getting my prerequisite courses in speech pathology and then my master's degree, a lot of the material made a lot of sense to me coming from a linguistics background. But without that background in that underlying science of language, the information can feel very disjointed. And the multiple areas of our scope of practice can feel very disparate, right? Well, what does aphasia have in common with a 2-year-old learning language? Well, it's all language science. It's all the same thing. Not the same thing exactly, but there's a lot of the same principles and concepts at play across the age span and across the scope of practice. So I got really interested in, how can we kind of bridge some of this theoretical information with the applied information? So at that point, I knew I wanted a PhD, but I wanted the clinical experience first. So my first job was in a children's hospital. I did inpatient brain and spinal cord injury, and I also did outpatient work. So birth to 21, pretty much the whole scope of practice except voice. I think I had 1 or 2 clients with voice disorders who I gave some basic recommendations to and referred out since that's not my area of expertise. And so I like to say that I specialized as a generalist, which meant referring out when someone needed a more specialized person. But I also felt like seeing kind of that broad spectrum of ages and needs and client profiles kind of helped me see the commonalities across what our clients are dealing with, but also kind of take a bigger picture approach to supporting individual clients. So, if I have a 12-year-old with a brain injury on the brain injury unit, well, when he discharges, he's going back to school and he's going to have language needs in school. And so kind of the school medical separation never made sense to me because it's the same kid in both settings. With the same, if he's not comprehending complex sentences in his medical visit, he's also not comprehending them when he's supposed to be reading them in his books or hearing them in a lecture. So I think it helped me with kind of that broader planning and understanding the needs of my clients.
That's great. Yeah. And I've worked in clinical settings and also school-based. So I think the environment is so different, right? The need might look the same, but the way that the services are delivered and implemented is so very different. Interesting. Yeah, I love your background. That's so fascinating. Yeah.
So I never want to minimize the differences in settings, but I think we also miss opportunities to think about the similarities because those are there as well.
Yeah, that's good. I like the idea of discovery major. Never heard that before. I like that. I've never heard that. Seems like something a future PhD would know is discovery major. I like that idea. I've never heard that term before. I'm like, oh, that makes, because my kids are getting older, my own 3 kids, I'm like, oh, yeah, okay, this is good. I like to learn new things. I'm learning, Kathleen, I'm learning. One of the things that you talk about, or, maybe potentially why you started your page is the idea of Gestalt language processing. You discuss that on your page quite a bit. And you said that you already had another platform. I'm wondering, when you saw information that you felt like was misinformation out there on social media about areas that you're really well versed because you're studying so much and working clinically, I guess, how did that made you feel like motivated to start the page? I'm sorry, I'm going back to your motivation for social media, but I know that when I look at certain things on social media, I feel a certain way deep down inside. But do you feel that same way? Is that what spurred you to maybe start wanting to disseminate some other information?
I think over time, I've come to approach things like that with more curiosity than that kind of deep visceral reaction that I think a lot of people have, because I do a lot of linguistics outreach where I go to like science fairs and teach people about linguistics, and nobody has any idea what I'm talking about. People from the other sciences are like, are you even a scientist? And I don't think they say that because I'm a woman. I know there's huge issues with sexism for another time. I do think it's really, a lot of it is just, what are you?
Right.
And so it's become hard for me to kind of blame people for not knowing things about language science, even in the field of SLP, because we don't get a lot of training in linguistics and the science of language acquisition. A lot of this is stuff I either learned as an undergrad in linguistics or as a PhD student taking courses on language processing. I took 3 seminars on language processing. I took a course on language acquisition, a graduate course on language acquisition in the linguistics department. And so if I wasn't learning the stuff I'm sharing as an SLP master's student or in my post-bac preparing me for that master's, I can't blame other SLPs for not knowing it. And I certainly can't be upset with parents for, hearing something and sharing it because, they don't have the training either.
Yeah. And they just want to help support their child and they're going to do what they can do. Yeah, no, I absolutely understand that.
And I think SLPs really want to support the clients on their caseload. And a lot of us didn't learn how to do effective early intervention therapy. So I was lucky. I had a wonderful class in my master's program that taught me parent coaching, play-based, following the child's lead, all kinds of wonderful strategies. But if I hadn't had that, I can also understand how I would feel like my clients weren't making progress and I didn't know what to do. And it would be really enticing to hear about a new approach and want to try it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that makes you feel, I know when I first started working with kids who were not yet speaking, who engaged in some unsafe problem behavior, I felt I did not feel equipped. And I reached out to supervisors. I talk about this in my trainings, and I didn't have a framework. And I'm extremely type A, so I really wanted a framework to provide. So we just came out with a new course. When I say we, I mean me, about naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions, because I was like, look, I read this whole book and I just made it into a 5-hour CEU course just for you. Because it just makes so much sense and it is more naturalistic. And I think it's just the way my brain works as a speech therapist and BCBA to provide therapy in this way. But I think if you don't have this background, that you really don't understand how to do that. And then you feel ineffective. You're not sure where to go for information. And despite what my LinkedIn poll asked, I asked, like, where do you get information about, it's like journal articles, conferences, social media. Nobody says social media, but a lot of people are going to social media to get information about pain points that they might have in their job, where you feel overwhelmed, you feel ineffective, you feel like you're not reaching your students. And that for us who are therapy providers, that is a bad feeling, right? And so I think people are just trying what they're hearing about. So you do talk about Gestalt language processing quite a bit. I guess, what are like some of the top things that you would want all professionals and parents to know about Gestalt language processing?
Sure. So I think first, I just want to make sure we're defining our terms because there's a lot of different definitions floating around out there. So Gestalt language processing, as I'll be talking about it, is the hypothesized way that some people develop language. And it's contrasted with analytic language processing in those spaces where these are the terms that are being used. And this is different from what I've heard from some autistic adults who've told me that they view Gestalt language processing or being a Gestalt language processor as like an identity label, where they just view it as shorthand for the way that they celebrate using their own echolalia and using scripts or gestalts or their preferred term for them. And I am not trying to take away anyone's choice of identity label. I think echolalia is great. It can be communicative. It has meaning. We should not be extinguishing it. But once we start using GLP or Gestalt Language Processor as a clinical label, where we're using a checklist of characteristics as an SLP to determine if someone is a GLP, and then using that label to say, okay, well, GLPs need this kind of therapy, not that kind of therapy, that's no longer an identity term. In that context, we're using it as a clinical label. And that's where I think it's reasonable and necessary to have open and honest conversations about the evidence behind making a GLP ALP distinction and then making therapy decisions based on that distinction. And much of what is shared on social media about ALPs or analytic language processors, which they say is like typical language development, isn't true of typical language development. There's been decades of research on language acquisition. There are ongoing debates within the field of language acquisition, but there is agreement among people who study it that the word is not the first thing children learn. It might be the first thing they say. It's not the basis of learning. This is not a podcast about in-depth discussions of language acquisition, but I just do want people to know that there's a ton of research out there, and it's generally not aligned with ALP or GLP as a description of language development trajectories. And so that was actually another one of my motivations.
That's okay. That's interesting because I did. So I think it was maybe 3 years now. I had reached out to Alex, this person that created the Meaningful Speech course. She's a speech therapist and is, has a really large Instagram presence, and she's very nice. She was very nice to me. And she let me into the Meaningful Speech course. I wanted to kind of view it just to see. And one of the things that I thought we could take away from it is, you said don't extinguish echolalia, it's communicative and, things like that. There are things like that that are shared that are just, we as general speech language pathologists are doing those things. But it's a lot of information. I always kind of I was like, oh, okay. I like how you said that is the way that it's talked about in certain circles. Like you're either analytical or Gestalt. Because here at ABA Speech, I'm talking a lot about kids who are not yet speaking. So, but that's good to know that maybe the science is not even aligned with what is shared about what an analytical processor is. And that is that term, because I just don't know, analytic processor, is that something that's come out of people that are sharing about Gestalt? Or is that a term that is used in research or clinically?
That is not a term that is used in research. So you will not find academic research that uses the term ALP or GLP. So that's the other piece where, we see on social media, no one's researching GLPs. Well, it's not like the research is all about ALPs. Well, no, because what's being shared on social media about ALPs is not consistent with the literature on how language develops in most kids. And ALP is not a term used outside of those GLP and NLA circles.
Oh, okay. So I think that's important to talk and discuss. Yeah, you'll have to share with me, maybe even after the show. Something I always try to do at ABA Speech is try to read the research myself and bring it to treating clinicians, because sometimes it's hard. And I'm wondering if you probably definitely know about research that might be helpful for speech therapists and BCBAs. That's not even from, because I just get on the BCBA website. We have access to a lot of journals. So I'm like looking at JABA. I'm looking at all the stuff that comes out from ASHA. They do send you a nice email with like highlights of what's come out from research. And so a lot of people I have on the show are people who are doing that research and trying to bridge that research practice gap that we have. So if there's anything about that you think I should share, sometimes we do journal article reviews in my membership, the ABA Speech Connection, where we read an article and do more intermediate learning. And then we get together in a small group and we discuss it. So if there's anything like that after the show, please send it to me, because I feel like there's probably a lot of good information that we just, when you don't know, you don't know. You know what I'm saying? Like people that are treating kids 5 days a week in a clinic or a school probably don't know about some research that we probably should learn about and we should probably read about. But yeah, I think you're right too, just saying like our scope of practice as speech language pathologists is so broad. And that's really what kind of drove me to the field is, wow, I could help this person who has aphasia, or I could help this person who's 2 or traumatic brain injury. But there's so much that we don't know. And I think that would be really helpful information. Anything else you want to share about GLP before I get into my next question?
Sure. So I think another thing to think about is actual language processing research. So those of us who study language processing or psycholinguistics, we're kind of interested in what's happening like moment by moment in the brain as language unfolds. So as you're hearing a sentence, how are you processing it? And so to study that, we don't use language samples or observation of expressive language. We have come up with a bunch of research methods over the past many decades. A common one I use is eye tracking research. So we might show multiple pictures on a screen, and then as someone's hearing a sentence, we can measure their eye movements of where they're looking. And so this method lets us study kids who aren't speaking, kids who will not participate in kind of standard point to the ball, point to the apple kind of testing. And they can do it in their own home on their mom's lap. And so there's been studies of, young autistic kids, they get to sit on their mom's lap at home with a screen up in front of them and a video camera measuring their eye movements. And they might hear a sentence like, look at the ball. And then they actually will. You can use their eye movements to show that they might look at the picture we're talking about even if in a different task where we said point to the ball, they weren't participating. So we have ways of assessing that kind of receptive language that we might not see otherwise when we use these more fine-grained scientific tools. They don't have clinical utility yet. It is still a research tool. But methods like that have actually shown that young autistic kids who aren't producing questions or really answering them in their spoken language are understanding them. So if you have like a flower and a ball and they see a video of the flower hitting the ball, and then you say, what hit the ball? They will look at the flower more than half the time. So if they were that, and so that tells me that these kids who were labeling as, chunky processors, they process the thing as a whole, it seems like they might still be using some kind of word by word or analytic process to make meaning out of that question, even if they're not understanding them or asking them. So we don't yet have the research connecting that to tell you what to do in clinic. But in terms of saying, are there these underlying differences in what syntactic processing looks like in different groups of kids, not only do we not have evidence of a difference, our evidence points to a lack of a difference when we're specifically talking about syntactic processing. Now, that development might happen much slower in some kids than others, but the sequence and the fact that they are, creating meaning without just this whole chunk at a time, we do seem to have evidence for that.
That's interesting. And so do you think that research is is that research you think covered in journals that speech language pathologists traditionally have access to? Or is that, you know what I'm saying? Like, am I going to be able to go to ASHA and like, I'm not saying a lot of people are going to be able to do this because a lot of people are treating clients 5 days a week, but I'm just curious, like off the top of my head, I'm just wondering, like, do we as speech language pathologists easily have access to that type of literature? Because it's interesting. And I actually reached out and corresponded with somebody, I think from Stanford, who was doing some type of eye tracking and maybe to diagnose autism really, really young. And she ended up not coming on the show, or we lost that email chain. But it was interesting to talk about, like, this isn't just like a gut feeling that people are having. There's actually research, and this is how we're analyzing it in this very specific way. Now, that you say that it's like research ready and it's not, it's not something we're using clinically. But I do think it's great to hear about those things because as a treating clinician, I don't know about those things. I only know about those things because I almost had a podcast guest on that was doing something a little similar. But I think most people are not aware that this is how this research is being produced and that the research is out there and available. It might just be not something that's come across our desks as treating speech therapists or treating BCBAs. But that's fair to say, right? That we just don't know about it.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's a great point. As you were asking, I was just scrolling through my reference list, and most of them are journals that are not ASHA journals. So yeah, if that's where we have access, some of them are open access, but you'd still have to search outside of ASHA for them. Right. But there are journals, I've seen articles in the ASHA journals about language processing and using these kind of eye tracking methods. So the ones I'm specifically thinking about that come to mind for autism aren't in the ASHA journals, but I also think, there is more in the ASHA journals than maybe we realize unless we're doing regular deep dives, which again, a practicing clinician, I wouldn't expect to be, searching through every single new issue to see what's there.
Yes, we're based in reality here, Kathleen. We know that is an issue. That's why I try to read all the books and read all the articles and have smart people like you on. Okay, interesting. Okay, I feel like I'm learning a lot. Okay, my next question is, can you define pseudoscience for us and what to look out for as practitioners, as somebody who's been in the field over 20 years? I'm not going to call everybody out, but we know that there's been a lot of stuff that people have implemented in therapy that did not have robust intervention and maybe has now come out, and ASHA has a position statement about it as something that we should not be doing. But I think that word pseudoscience kind of gets thrown around, and can you just define it for us? And what does pseudoscience really look like?
Sure. So pseudoscience, when we're talking about clinical practice, is something that looks scientific, is maybe pretending to be scientific. We're talking about it in a scientific way, and it's just not scientifically based at all. So it's not the same thing as being wrong. It's not the same thing as being unethical. It's a specific way of being wrong. In fact, pseudoscience can be correct and for all the wrong reasons. If the reasoning behind it checks all the boxes of pseudoscience. So I think of it as really being about the way something is advertised or marketed or talked about or explained, rather than being about a specific practice being pseudoscience or not, right? So like essential oils, right? They're pseudoscience if I'm claiming that they'll cure all your ailments. The fact that I have an essential oil diffuser on my desk because I like the smell is not pseudoscience, right? So the oils themselves are not science or pseudoscience. It's how we talk about them. And so specifically, we want to look at a big red flag is the way someone's using evidence. So are they only presenting the evidence for their therapy and just saying, oh, ignore, some of those, some naysayers don't like what we're doing, but, we can ignore them because they just don't understand it. Or are they really engaging with the disconfirming evidence and saying, yeah, this other study does suggest another approach, and here's why I still like mine. So if we're not even acknowledging that disconfirming evidence, we're not changing what we're doing in response to disconfirming evidence, those would be things to look out for pseudoscience. Inadequate evidence, relying on anecdotes. Anecdotes are not evidence. Even 400 anecdotes are not evidence. A study of 400 people would be great evidence, but that's different from 400 anecdotes, because when you have your 400 anecdotes, you don't know who's not included in them. So you could have 400 people who say they benefited from a certain therapy, but you didn't systematically collect data about whether they actually got that therapy delivered to fidelity. You don't know how many people tried the therapy and it didn't work. You don't know how many people tried a different therapy and saw benefit from that. So we really have to be careful about anecdotal evidence. And when I don't use anecdotal evidence to change my mind about therapy, that's not because I think the people giving those anecdotes are lying.
Right.
It's because there's just a lot of information that's not included in a collection of anecdotes that's still really necessary. So we've got kind of those things about, and then also a big thing in pseudoscience is they typically avoid peer review. So they'll disseminate their information directly to the public, either through news articles, social media, self-published books, newsletters. And then what can happen is then someone who's published a bunch of that's not peer reviewed, they might write a peer reviewed article describing all those other articles. So now they have a peer reviewed article with a long list of citations in the reference section, none of which are peer reviewed, but then they get to say, oh, look, there's a peer reviewed thing about what I do. So even when something is peer reviewed, we need to look at, is this a peer reviewed paper with new data? What's the peer reviewed article citing? So then there's issues with kind of how evidence is portrayed that makes something pseudoscientific. And then there's also things about like the way they talk about the science. So are they promising some big broad outcome or really vague explanations about why it works? It only works, within our broad framework. If you change anything, it won't work at all. You can't study it. It's too broad. Maybe making up new terms that sound scientific, but are really unique to that specific therapy to give it kind of that weight of, oh, these are science sounding words. This must be scientifically based. Or being a big one is just being completely disconnected from the evidence. So maybe you have a therapy that actually overlaps a lot with something that works, but you're not citing any of that evidence that's even in support of your therapy because you're so disconnected from it. And then, of course, that's in addition to ignoring all the disconfirming evidence.
Oh, I like that idea of making up new terms. Yeah, that's a gem. I think that's important. Yeah, there's just so much. Yeah, the way you think about this is so deep. I love it. I just read something and I'm like, that is such crap. You are very analytical and I like it. And this is why I wanted to have you on. Oh, I really like that.
It's so easy to start thinking like, oh, someone said this is pseudoscience. They think they're smarter than me. And it's really not about being smart or not smart. In fact, there's an entire book called Michael Shermer called Why Do Smart People Believe Weird Things? Very smart people can read something pseudoscientific and believe it and implement it. And in fact, you don't need to be some, like a PhD to see pseudoscience. So the big paper in our field, Finn et al. 2005, that kind of published a list of pseudoscience criteria for SLPs. Part of that paper also involved asking graduate students, master's students in SLP, here's a list of criteria. Can you apply them to these two therapies? And they found that graduate students who were just kind of given the list could, with reasonable accuracy, identify the characteristics. So it is something we are all capable of. We have to remind ourselves we all have advanced degrees and we're all capable of taking these characteristics and looking at a new therapy and saying, how many boxes does it check? You don't need the fancy, pedigree or anything like that to make a choice to critically reason about a therapy before you implement it.
Oh, I love that. Yes, critically reason before you implement a new therapy. I think that's so important in analyzing, why are we doing the things that we're doing? Is it tied to the literature? Is it tied to the research? I think one thing that makes me nervous just as a mom and clinician is if we implement things that are pseudoscience, that it can eventually be harmful in the fact that we know from early intervention and neuroplasticity that there's a time frame where students are potentially going to learn more and they're, ready to learn and their brains are a little sponge and all those general things that we learn as clinicians. And if we implement something that is not pseudoscience in favor, or something that is more pseudoscience, it doesn't have a lot of research back, that we can never get that time back. I think that's what makes me nervous when I see people talking about things that are not backed by research or language science and literature, is that it just makes me nervous because I don't want people to regret, either from that are practitioners or parents, about implementing something that is maybe not going to be the most helpful in the long run for clinicians. And that's probably one of the harmful things about pseudoscience, is that we are losing that really important clinical time for learners. Would you say that's probably accurate?
Yeah, I think that's really true, and that's a really good point. And we don't want to undersell the critical thinking skills that we bring to the table as speech pathologists, because something I hear a lot in discussions of pseudoscience is, someone says, well, does it work? There's no evidence it does work, but there's not evidence for alternatives, which isn't true. We often do have evidence for alternatives, and we've just done a bad job disseminating it. But what I think is the better question to ask is, should it work? Based on what I know and what is known about the underlying science of language, does it make sense for this new therapy to work? And that's a question we can be asking ourselves, without a randomized controlled trial. I don't demand a randomized controlled trial before I try something new. I want to know that it makes sense, that it could work based on what we know about theory. I want to know that the terms are clearly defined enough that I could implement the same thing that was implemented in the paper. Now, maybe we do have good empirical evidence that something does work and we don't know why. And that's okay too in the clinical world, but we do need something.
One other question just came to mind is, so maybe it's the wrong term, but when somebody writes a white paper, is a white paper just like an opinion piece or am I getting that definition wrong? Like, I know some people, like you talked about how it might be a peer review thing and they're going back and using all these citations, and maybe those citations are things that they just wrote. Like, how somebody can just write something, maybe even from ASHA, that's not exactly clinical research, but it still gets published. And I think sometimes for people, it's hard to understand. And I talked about this in one of my free what the Gestalt or, trainings I did, like the different types of research. Because if you're not getting your PhD, you might have forgotten. I mean, sorry, Ryzen, who's super smart. And, thank you for listening to the show. She is very smart and she remembers her research class, but I don't. I remember my research class from my BCBA because I was traumatized by it, but I don't remember my research class from speech pathology. I just don't, because there are different types of research that's going to come out that you're going to read in journal versus something that might just be a narrative piece. I know I'm saying those terms wrong, but am I getting at something that is, I think that's important for speech therapists to know and BCBAs.
Yeah. So, a great thing to do for any new journal is Google journal name article types. So, ASHA, SIG perspectives, article types.
Right.
And you will come to a page where the editors of that journal have defined the types of articles they accept, and they'll write a paragraph about what each article type is. So they might say, we have viewpoint articles in this journal, and here's what a viewpoint article is. We have articles called research articles, and here's what we require for something to count as a research article. So that's a good guide to start with. And then you don't even need to remember your research methods class because they're telling you,
Right.
specifically for that journal, how they define different article types. In terms of white paper, I don't think that has like a specific definition. I
Okay.
think of them a lot that industry puts out white papers
Okay.
where they'll, maybe analyze kind of trends in
hmm
usage data and do, legitimate statistics on it, but it's not reviewed by anyone. It's their in-house
Yeah.
PhD
Okay.
statistician who's probably a very competent, ethical
hmm
researcher, but they wrote it
Right.
and then it goes on the website without this peer review process that,
Yeah.
has its own problems, but can also make research a lot better and contribute and can, kind of ensure that there's no major gaps in what's getting put out there.
Okay, interesting. And yeah, viewpoints. I think sometimes when people see something that's been published or it's on a website, BACB or ASHA or whatever it is, or just anywhere in a website, that people think that, oh, that must mean that this is research. This is now, I know that there's a difference there because of what I've been doing, with my small business at ABA Speech. But I think for some people that haven't really thought about all the different types of journal articles that are out there, that some people kind of get skewed and we're missing that critical analyzing about what does this mean? Where did this come from? And I think it's important to make that distinction. Okay, great. Is there anything else we have not unearthed about research? Like, what is one thing you wish consumers on social media knew about research? Is there any lasting comment you want to make about that?
Yeah, so we're not rich. We're not swimming in money. I think the big thing I would like people to take away is sort of, if you haven't studied how to do research, you don't know what we're doing, but you also don't know what you don't know about research. So as a clinician, if I had a kid on my caseload and I was like, I actually have no idea what to do for this child, I would never tell the parent, there's no way to help your child. They can't be helped. Nothing can be done. Bye. Right? So then why would I, about a research question, say, this can't be studied. There's no way to ethically do this in a clinical trial. Right? Maybe there is, and maybe I just don't have anywhere close to the training or experience running clinical trials to conceptualize the many creative ways that researchers have come up with to be extremely ethical and do well-designed research for this kind of question. And there's so many research methods out there and statistical methods out there that don't get covered in your one semester of a master's level research course. And so I would much rather people say, how could you even research this? Can this be researched? Has this been researched? What would be a good next step? Than to make these blanket statements about, all research does this or research can't do that. Maybe it's true, but maybe we have solved that problem and maybe it will be solved in 25 years. And so let's be open to all the things we might not know about research, just in the same way that with our clients, if we don't know what to do, we go seek out someone who does.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. So thank you so much for coming on the show. It's just delightful to talk to you. Where can people find out more about you and follow your work?
Sure. So if you're interested in the outreach I do about language processing research, Instagram at language_processing. My more general work on language science outreach is at the Instagram handle at the language scientists, all one word. I ran that with a couple of classmates. We haven't updated it in years, but it is kind of a static representation of what we did, if that's interesting to you. And then my Google Scholar page. We can link to that in the show notes. Just has information about my research.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was really great to connect.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great to meet you.
Thanks for listening to Autism Outreach. If you enjoyed the show today, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode full of actionable strategies you can use in your therapy room. Write a review too. That would mean so much to me. I always love hearing from you. Have a specific topic that you want included on a future show? Reach out over on Instagram, ABA Speech by Rose, or visit me at www.abaspeech.org.